Welcome to my beginning watercolor tip number 11, all about edges. When two shapes come together, they form an edge. Once that edge is formed, that edge is going to be a hard edge, or it's going to be a soft edge. It's going to occur either in positive space or negative space. It's also either going to be lost or a found edge. To illustrate this concept, I'm going to do an exercise here where I'm going to repeat the same very simple design that I've drawn here in multiple squares, and I'm going to vary the approach in each one of these squares. So in the first square, I'm painting this in a manner to illustrate hard edges. I'm painting with flat washes, using a few different values here to show these shapes by using hard edges. Here I'm taking a bit lighter tone, but again it's a flat wash up against the edges of the various shapes, and everything in this little square right now represents a hard edge. This next square is going to be soft edge, and to help that along, I'm going to wet the square with clear water, and then I'm going to let it dry just a little bit, and then I'm going to come in and start applying some pigment. So I'm kind of following the same value pattern here, and you can see the edges start to diffuse a little bit. I might have let that dry just a little bit more, so I'll probably hit it here with a spray bottle to make them even a softer edge. But the first square was painted wet on dry to give me crisp, hard edges, and this is being painted wet into wet to give me soft, diffused edges. I want those edges to be softer yet, so I'm going to take a fine mist spray bottle and give a light spray over top of what I've applied, and that's going to soften that up even more. Here I continue to apply a lighter value in some of this area, and it's still wet into wet, so I've got very diffused soft edges in this square. The next two squares, I'm going to be talking about positive and negative space. So when I'm working on the interior edges of a shape, I call those positive edges, and I'm working in positive space. So in the inside of that leaf, if I'm painting the inside of that leaf, I consider that a positive space. It's the item in the most forward in my composition, and it's overlapping anything behind it. If I go to the right and start looking at this, if I'm painting on the exterior edges around that leaf or that stem shape, I refer to that as a negative edge because I'm working in negative space in relationship to that leaf. So if I'm on the inside of that leaf right there, I'm working positively, and if I'm on the outside, I'm working in negative space. Now, you have to consider the context of each shape. Basically, the overlapping shape, the interior edge of an overlapping shape is a positive edge, and the exterior edge of an overlapping shape is a negative edge. So if I look at the small leaf, that right side of it, that's a positive edge in relationship to the space to the right, because it's overlapping the spaces to the right, to the shapes to the right. So if I'm on the exterior side, on the right exterior side, I'm working in negative space, and I call that a negative edge. Now if I move to the left side of this leaf shape, it's being overlapped by this other leaf. So if I'm working on that edge right there, I consider that a negative edge because that becomes negative space. So I hope you can understand how one shape can have a positive and negative edge, and often does because of overlapping. So the shape that's overlapping is normally a positive shape, and the shape that's beneath it creates an edge. When it comes to it, becomes a negative edge or a negative space. I know this gets confusing, so I'm going to slow things down and I'm going to go back through this. The shape that I have my brush on, I'm referring to as the middle leaf. That middle leaf on its right side has the overlapping edge because it's on top of the background, the stem, and the leaf shape to the lower right. So when I speak to that edge, I'm speaking to it as it relates to the middle leaf shape. So on the right side of that edge is an exterior edge, so I refer to that as a negative edge from the right side. If I move inside the leaf and I start working on the interior, I'm working on the interior or positive edge of that shape because it's the overlapping edge. Now when I move to the left side of that middle leaf, the middle leaf is being overlapped by the larger leaf shape to the left. So when I speak to that edge, I'm speaking to it as it relates to the larger leaf shape to the left, no longer the middle leaf. And that is the exterior edge of that leaf shape on the right, or a negative edge. And when I move inside that larger leaf shape, I'm now talking about an interior or positive edge. Most often I hear people refer to negative space or negative shapes. I'm not sure I've heard anybody refer to it as positive and negative edges as I do, but that's a terminology that works for me to describe my process and my way of thinking. And I think too often people think of negative space just as the background. And really, that's not the case. It's wherever you have overlapping shapes, which is throughout an entire composition. So for this next example here, these next two, I'm going to use the square on the left to demonstrate positive edges and positive shapes, and on the right, negative edges and negative space. And for this, the purpose of this exercise, I'm going to keep this very simple. I'm not going to worry about the overlapping of the leaves, which would normally come into play on these two squares. I'm just going to think of it in regards to the leaves and the stem shapes overlapping the background. So I have simplified a lot just to make this illustration. So I've painted the interior edges of the leaves and the stems, and now I have my positive shapes. Now I'm moving over to the right square, and I'm going to do just the opposite. So I'm going to paint around the exterior edges or the negative edges of all these shapes, and I'm just going to paint the background. So just as I said, a lot of times this is how people think of positive and negative shapes and edges, just the background or painting the object itself. But really, as I try to illustrate before I started painting here, wherever the edges overlap, you have the opportunity to use positive and negative space. But for these two squares, I'm keeping it very simple. So on the left is positive shapes, on the right are negative shapes or negative space. As a quick recap, so far I've painted hard edges in this left square, painted soft edges here on the right. Now moving down to the left, I've got positive shapes painting inside interior edges. And then to the right, I've painted the negative space or exterior edges around those shapes. Now I'm going to illustrate lost and found edges. So on this first square to the left, I'm going to do it in a manner where I'm working primarily in positive space. So I'm starting to apply a tone on the interior edges of these shapes. But you'll see as I apply the paint and the value, I let that run over other shapes. So as the as the edge starts to soften, it starts to disappear, and it starts to blend right in with the shape right beside it. So on this leaf here, I have a darker tone to the top of the leaf, and I let it grade out to a lighter value, and I carry that tone into another leaf shape, And at that point, that edge just starts to disappear and get lost. So that's where you get the lost and found edges. And now here I'm applying some tone on the stem, and I've taken some water and I've gradated that wash a little bit and let that disappear. You can still see the pencil lines, but once I erase these pencil lines, you'll start to see that how some of those edges just start to fade away as you start to get a softer, even a lighter value. Most often, your found edge is a hard edge and your lost edge is a soft edge, but not always. You can do a painting with completely hard edges and still have lost and found edges. You break up your shapes and you break up your linear brush marks, and don't just outline. And you can let white areas of paper merge into other shapes, and you get the same effect as a softening edge. But most often, it's a combination of hard edge, soft edge, broken up lines that help create this suggestion of lost and found edges. I'm going to put a little bit of a wash here, gradated wash on this leaf shape in the lower left to this middle leaf, and just by putting that dark tone there, I helped start to describe the leaf to the left that I didn't even touch, but just by painting around the exterior edge, it starts to bring that other shape forward. Here I'll point out, see some of those edges disappearing, and they start to blend, they get soft and they disappear. This stem shape coming in, all of a sudden it just fades away. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about lost and found edges. So now I'm moving to the right side of this paper, and I'm going to start demonstrating lost and found edges again, but working more on the negative edges of shapes. So here I've started on the negative edge of that large leaf shape with a dark value tone. And as I start to apply my wash, you're going to see some of these shapes start to come out and start to move forward as I work along the exterior edges of them, or the negative edge. And I'll start to describe some of these leaves, even though I haven't put a paintbrush to them, the shape itself. They're starting to come forward because of what I'm doing around the exterior edge, or the negative edge of the object. I'm continuing to work around the negative edges here, and I'm going to develop this section here, this example, much further than the other one so far, so that I can illustrate to you how I develop my paintings and how I build up layer upon layer and start to get depth and get colors weaving and values weaving throughout a composition. So this is going to get more involved, and I'm going to be a little bit more, use my imagination a little bit more to create some shapes over top and behind things here, just as a way to illustrate to you how far you can take this. I think when people see a large painting and it has all this negative shapes and values and color weaving around, it gets intimidating, but really it's just a larger scale assemblage of these smaller pieces. And here you can see that I'm given a suggestion of another shape just by painting around what would be the exterior edges of it, or negative space. And this is how I start to build layers in my paintings and try and make the backgrounds interesting. It's a lot of times people will paint something such as a flower or an animal or some type of an object, and they ask the question, should I put a background on it? And I've seen people on Facebook ask that, and I don't work that way. I've stated in some of my other videos, I try to develop the painting as a whole for the most part, and design the whole composition, not just the object that I'm trying to describe, but I work to design and describe the background, the foreground, all areas of my composition. One of the important elements of design in working with positive and negative shapes and lost and found edges is value contrast. Without value contrast, it's very difficult to have a successful painting. there are paintings that have been, or that are successful high key paintings and whatnot that have a limited use of value contrast, but for the most part, the successful paintings have effectively used value contrast to their advantage. You can see some of these shapes that I'm putting in here, linear shapes. As I break them up, I start them, I stop them, they give a suggestion there that they're going behind something. This starts to build layers and starts to build depth, and it's light upon dark and dark upon light and just going back and forth. And this is where you start to get some dimension and some depth, and you start to push areas of your composition further back and bring others forward. I use this approach a lot in my floral paintings, but it also works in landscapes. It can be done very effectively in cityscapes. I like to paint cityscapes from time to time, and I like to work a lot with lost and found edges and hard and soft edges, and work with positive and negative shapes. So little by little, it takes a little patience, but you work with your shapes and work off of positive and negative edges, and use your value contrast, and it will really start to make a difference in your painting. Even though I'm focusing on edges here, I'm still going to put another plug in for value contrast. Up to this point, I pretty much haven't gone much beyond a middle value, and now I've got a very dark value, and I'm using dark valued brush marks, if you will, to help reinforce some of these edges. And just a mark along a lost edge all of a sudden brings it into focus. And you don't outline the edge, it's just the suggestion of a small mark, and it helps reinforce that there's an edge there and helps the eye continue it on and complete it. And you can take these dark values and give the suggestion that they're going behind or over top of other shapes. And again, this is just another way to build depth and interest and make your composition interesting. In order to keep this simple and for clarity, I've stuck to one color for these exercises because it's much easier to see the point that I'm trying to illustrate. Once you start involving the complexity of color, sometimes you get lost and it just makes it harder to see the principle being described. That being said, this could have been done with multiple colors, and you could have gradations of color and value going on here, and it'd be quite interesting. You could have yellows and greens and blues at work here, and that's what normally would happen in your painting. And even though this is just a little sketch I put together for an exercise, just imagine this as being a smaller element of a larger piece of work, and I'm going to show you that here in just a second. In this last example, I've used all the variations that I've described in the previous exercises: hard and soft edges, positive and negative edges, and I've been also have lost and found edges going on. And now I'm going to put up an example of a painting where all these techniques have been used. So here is a painting that has a lot of foliage going on, and there's a lot of overlapping, but I've used all these techniques in the development of this painting. I have lost edges, found edges, hard and soft edges. I've been working in positive and negative space. And now if you can imagine that exercise I just did as an element of this painting, and I'm going to zoom in here to kind of illustrate that. If you look at this and compare, you can see how the exercise I did translates to a painting. So I've got a lot of these techniques that I was describing going on in the execution of this painting. Now, the last thing I'm going to do for this video is I'm going to revisit the square where I did the exercise of just soft edges. And I'm going to show you how just placing some shapes in negative space can bring other shapes forward. So I'm imagining a leaf shape here that's in the background behind some of these other shapes, and I'm painting a flat tone. But watch how as I paint this leaf, now it starts to describe the other things going on in the composition. Some of the edges that were lost because they're so soft, I'm putting this shape in the background which has hard edges, and now it's beginning to describe those other two leaf shapes and the stem shape there, just by placing that one shape in the background. And now, if you can imagine building layers like this, you can see how you can build depth in a painting. I'm going to go to another area in this square, and I'm going to look for another spot to try and bring out some more shapes. So similar here, I'm painting a dark valued leaf shape on the exterior edges of these overlapping shapes, which would be overlapping the stem and this other leaf. And I've left the leaf and the stem, the edges just get lost to one another. But here again, I've placed another dark valued shape in the background, and now I start to see more what's going on in front of it. And I'm going to do one more of those. Similar, I'm coming over to this side, and again, another dark leaf shape, and it helps describe the lost edges of the stem and the leaves. So now just by putting those three shapes in, you can start to see more of the composition come forward, and you can see I still have lost and found edges. So I started with soft edges, and then I've come in with some hard edge shapes that are in the background, and now I start to see more definition in what's going on, but I still have lost and found edges. And now taking this fine mist spray on top of that, it's softened some edges, but it's still kept hard edges. And it just gives a gradation that makes for a very interesting effect in a painting. In that painting I just showed, there's some of this going on with some of that tone, where I've put a hard edge in, but then I've softened it and gradated it out with a fine mist spray. Now I'm going to use some gradated washes, not just some hard shapes, and do a little bit more painting on negative edges. So I'm working on the exterior edges of overlapping shapes with a gradated wash. So it provides a hard edge against the overlapping shape, but then it's a soft edge going the other way. Here's another leaf shape with a very soft lost edge, and I want to bring some of that into focus. So to do that, I'm presenting a hard edge value against its exterior edge and then softening it going the other way, gradating it, and it leaves that hard edge effect on the leaf, but it's very soft going the other way. Now I'm going to help build depth by taking a linear shape and moving it behind some of these other shapes here. So I'm going to take a dark value and I'm going to put a linear mark that moves through the composition, and it stops at the edges of these other shapes. That helps build overlap, helps build depth. So what I've done here is I've come back to this second exercise, which was just soft lost edges, and by adding a few shapes and a couple washes and a few linear marks, I've started to give definition and depth to the composition. This is much like how I approach my paintings. I start with a large loose wash, and I build these layers little by little and give it definition, and then it starts to evolve into a complete painting, such as the one here, which I showed earlier. This painting began with a large loose wash around some major shapes, and then I started to work each area and build them using the techniques which I've showed in this exercise. And little by little, it starts to come together as a complete painting. But there's lots of negative painting in here, positive painting, there's hard edges, soft edges, and lots of lost and found edges. And just to touch back on the negative space and the use of negative space, It's occurring not just in the background, but wherever there's overlapping shapes throughout the whole composition. That's my All About Edges Part 1. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. In Part 2, I'm going to use a cityscape as the subject matter. I'm going to take a large cityscape painting that I've done, and I'm going to recreate a smaller element of it using these same principles. If you ever have a question about any of the materials I use in any of my videos, you can always go to the studio page of my website where I have a complete listing of most of the materials and equipment that I use. If you have a specific question, you can email me at contactsurowicz@gmail.com and follow me on Facebook. And if you like my video, please like it, share it, and don't forget to comment.